Than and I lived in Evansville, Indiana. And I, after teaching at the University of Evansville, had taken an assistant ministerial role at Redeemer Lutheran Church. Now, in those days, as Than would remember, I wrote all the time. This is another piece of the craft. And if you're into this sort of thing, whatever your craft is, you don't ask yourself whether you should do this or not. You do it. You fail, you do it. You fail, you do it. And you scarcely realize that absolutely you are practicing. You're learning the craft exactly as if you were an athlete who has to practice and practice and practice again in order to accomplish the goal you have set there. So, generally, Than would go to bed at 9 o'clock and I would stay up. We lived in a horrible apartment. It had roaches. Not our fault, I promise you. It was throughout that whole building. But I would write then from 9 o'clock on, typewriter, and I don't know how late I would go, but I would continue to write. Practice, practice, practice. Now here's the bad thing. I remember I wrote a story that absolutely enamored me. I often would show these things to Than. She'd be reading it and I'd be butting in. Look at that. What do you think of that word? Isn't that a perfect word? This story, when she had read it, she gave it to me and she said, "This is a bad story." I said, "No, Than. This is a good story. Look at the balance that I've done. See how I build the episodes up until you get to that final scene?" "No," she said, "this is a bad story." A morally bad story. It absolutely undercut goodness in people. It drove deep enough into our behavior that it had become an accusatory lie. You learn. You learn of the effect of the story itself and that it isn't just craft. There is a right and a wrong to it. If you have the power to shift the world even just a little bit, you have the power to make a lie something that affects people around you. I have never doubted since those days that those of you who have some kind of an ability like this have more power in your hands than you know. Therefore, the morality of what you do, the ethic of what you do, has always got to be remembered. If you have a powerful tool in your hand, you don't use it just to use it. Look what I can do, Mama. You use it with a sense that if it has such an effect, it ought to be used right. This is a bad story, she said. And again, I remember that story perfectly from the beginning to the end. But after those days, it never saw the light of day again. It only exists in my mind as a terrible caveat. So at Redeemer Lutheran Church, I had all kinds of responsibilities. Kept me busy all the time. I could list them. I won't. There was in that congregation, which was a fairly large congregation, in a large upper middle class, in a large stone sanctuary, there was a woman named Clara Schreiber who was in her 90s. She would come to church crouched like this, leaning on a cane, on the arm of her daughter, who was herself in her 60s. I would watch them come down the aisle. She was nearly blind. The glasses were very, very thick, but they didn't really finally support her sight. And they would come into a pew, and she would sit down quietly, and her daughter, Ruth, would sit beside her. Ruth, it turns out, had been a classmate of my father's, way back in Lombard, Illinois. Are you getting all this geography? Which is a suburb of Chicago. I didn't know that at the time. Ruth had some kind of a disability, which made her speech restricted, though the kindness doesn't require speech. The kindness is found in one's faith and face in one's behavior and one's faith. One day, I got a very formal letter. It came on pasteboard with beautiful calligraphy writing on it. It said, Walter Wangerin Jr., it said, "Be pleased to attend me in my house for lunch." Mrs. Schreiber. How formal, and how do you say no to an invitation like that? When I got to their house, I found that it was a small bungalow, and window, door, window, green shutters on it, and that was about it. I knocked on the door. Ruth invited me in. To the right, there was a small living room. Then there was a hallway here. There was a bedroom there, a bathroom, and then you came into the kitchen. That was the house. When we came into the kitchen, there was Clara Schreiber sitting behind the table with her back to the wall, seeing me come in like that. Whether she could see me or not, I wasn't sure. She grandly asked me to take a seat, and I did. She said we would eat first, but we was me. This is what they used to do to pastors. I don't know if they still do it these days or not. But I got the whole works. The whole German works. The whole German Sunday afternoon works, all by myself. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, with gravy in the potatoes, some kind of a vegetable, who remembers vegetables, and a dessert. And so I ate quietly while hawkishly Clara Schreiber looked at me. When my plate was fairly clean, Ruth asked if I wanted more potatoes, and I said no, and she put another whole handful of potatoes. Well, when we were done eating, Clara spoke to me. She said that she had particular reasons for inviting me. She said, first of all, she wanted to know if I were in any way like my grandfather, who had been her pastor, when her husband was Teacher Schreiber, who led the Lutheran school there, the principal. Well, this was my news, and this was news I hadn't expected. And I must say it excited me to be seen in the image of my grandfather. He died when I was 4, but I knew him well, and I loved him, and I was beloved of him. That she would make that connection was enough then for me to digest 2 meals. And I was happy. She said the second reason that she had invited me was that she would offer herself to be my mentor. I have, she said, published a little book of my own. This is the second most wonderful thing. How did she know I wrote? Nobody comes into our apartment after 9 o'clock in the evening. Somehow or other, the blind woman saw. And she had published a book. I didn't know many people like that who had actually written and published a book. Clara Schreiber had done that. Be my mentor. Don't answer, she said. Yes, I would say. No, don't answer, she said. Think about it. I remember that when I left, she gave me a book to read. To this day, I'm not quite sure why she did it, but it was a book, a biography of Mozart, which I read. I don't know why she gave me that, except that her tastes were classic and high. The third reason, she said, why I have invited you, she said, is that nobody, she said, nobody, you, she said, should never have to dance in the dark. Well, I did keep coming back and visiting her. And we did talk, and I did talk about my writing with her. And over the days, weeks, and months, I began to hear Clara Schreiber's story. If she was 90 and this was in the 70s, then you know she goes back previous to the 20th century. So when her husband was a teacher in Lombard, and she was a relatively young woman at that particular point, we're back in the 1920s. She was a writer. I knew this, I know this. It meant you do it. You practice, and you do it. But in those days, I suspect it wasn't just confined to the Lutherans. In those days, for a woman to write anything but Sunday school lessons, letters, cards, was considered vainglorious. You don't do that. particularly not a teacher's wife, not somebody who's in public like that. But you do it. Clara said that she would wait until her children were safely at school and her husband was off doing his work. She would take care of certain household duties first. This was her ritual, whatever it was. Scrubbing board, remember those things? Do a scrubbing board on Teacher Schreiber's white shirts. Certainly clean up the kitchen. I can only imagine the things that she did. But always she was holding her excitement back to the moment that she felt that she had honored every other responsibility and could go into the dining room where she went and sit at the dining room table, clear back a space for herself, take out a box of unlined typing paper and page by page start writing. That's what she did. She squeezed it in to all of her duties. But before her children and her husband came home, it was all put away. Nobody knew. She was writing a biography of Catherine Luther, Martin's wife. I'm not sure if she had a whole bunch of books around herself so she could get the research right. Somehow she did do that, get the research right. I don't know if she went to the library to get the materials. In those days, not much was written about Luther's wife. Oh, they were in the libraries, and they were often heavy tomes, but she was doing this on her own. But, as I say, when her family got home, there was no sign of it. This began in September, October, and she wrote all the way through the winter. Lombard, and it's cold. In those days, they had dark houses with very heavy drapes. You may remember those drapes. When they're closed, it's night outside no matter what. And that's how their dining room was hung. Ruth was her daughter who would go back and forth from school, and she often would sit with Ruth and work through the studies with her. When I met Ruth that first time that I was at their house, I heard a word that I had never heard before. Clara said, "Ruth is my amanuensis." Isn't that a wonderful word? And she used it like she was spilling salt. Ruth is my amanuensis. Look it up, if you can spell it. Now, in those early days, she was Ruth's teacher. So came the spring, and after the spring, school was going to be let out, and so she had timed her book exactly right. Before school was out, she pulled out that box again and put her manuscript into it and put it into a mailing envelope with a letter that said, "Would you please consider my manuscript for publication?" Signed, Samuel Schreiber. Oh, you had to do a lot of things. And she sent it away. And that was the last. Went about her life. It was summer. You do the things that you do for summer. She was a public person. My grandfather, whom she loved dearly, was also a public person. They had a good relationship for which I am profoundly grateful. Anytime somebody brings up a member of my family like that, I am myself illuminated to stand in those shadows. Grandpa Wangerin had a beautiful baritone voice. He was shorter than I am, and shorter even than his son, my father. He had white hair, which started back here, and it was just a plume, a mane of beautiful, soft, silken white hair. His voice was so good that he had been invited to try out for the Metropolitan Opera, but ministry was his call, and he was always absolutely bound to that call, as was my father. And so he served the family. And of course he worked together with Teacher Schreiber, but I think it was, I hope it was, a special, dear relationship that he would have with Clara. It was in the fall once again when Muhlenberg Press sent an envelope to Samuel Schreiber, a very thin, slim envelope. After work, after everyone was gone, when she felt that she had the righteousness to open up that letter, she did. She slid it open, and out came one page, typewritten. Sir, Samuel Schreiber, we like your manuscript very much. If you are willing, we will publish it. Clara told me that at that moment her heart just exploded. She leaped up from the chair, this old crone of a woman that was talking to me, blind and on her stick. In those days, the young woman leaped up from her chair, and she said she raised her arms and twirled in the middle of the dining room and danced for joy. But before she did, she pulled the drapes, lest anyone see vaingloriousness. This is my matriarch. On the one hand, I learned the right and the wrong of writing and what it can do. On the other hand, I learned the deep moral perseverance and patience against the odds of culture. And some of you know how heavy those odds are. Sometimes you understand you're swimming against the stream of culture which is as burdensome as those drapes. What a lovely woman. How did she know I was a writer? But how did she know to set me at ease about the things that a writer, an artist, whatever, runs into in order to practice the craft? Whatever they did to her in the 1920s, she turned around absolutely. There was no bitterness, there was no blame, but it gave her the insight to do the better thing, the opposite thing, for this young bloke, Walter Martin Wangerin, Jr., as she called me, who was just starting out as a writer. All along the way. Oh, Redeemer was a Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod Church. There's a long story behind this. When I finished my seminary studies, I actually ended up at what was called Seminex in those days, and it was not Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. Grace was an African-American congregation, and I was accepting a call to that particular place. And with all the other twistings and turnings that went on, I was ordained and installed by a fellow named Herman Newnaber, who was a part of a whole new kind of a church that was called the AELC in those days, Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. When that beautiful service was done in small grace, and people were toiling out of the church, I looked, and there in the very back view was Clara Schreiber, Missouri Synod. And her amanuensis sitting beside her, and she waited. She waited till almost everybody was out of the church. And she said to me as I went by, "But don't ever leave Jesus." My matriarch. I doubt I'll ever make her number of years, but I hope to God that every once in a while I have been smart enough and insightful enough to do for others what she did for me.